It's helpful, you might want to have the passage open. Just a reminder, it's on 1410 as we look at this together. We are just going through in September a little series looking at some of the key passages in James. Last week at the 9 o'clock service, we looked at chapter 1, and today we're looking at this key passage in chapter 2 of the book of James. So as you're finding it, I wanted to start with a little story for you. When I was 12 years old, my family moved from a village just outside of York up to Durham for my dad's new job. I'd been going to church with my parents for all my life, and so when we moved to Durham, I then went to the new church that they attended, which was just down the road from where we lived. The church, however, was quite traditional. It had a robed choir and a procession at the beginning, and ultimately the way that they saw getting youth involved with church was by getting them to carry the cross. And so for about a year or so, I dutifully did that wearing a dress and carried the cross and walked in. After about a couple of years, though, I decided that I wanted to take more ownership for my faith, and so I looked for another church. My sister was a student in Durham at the time, so I decided to go to her church, which was a very student-centric church. And it was totally different from the Church of England church I'd just come from. It was charismatic, with a strong emphasis on the work of the Holy Spirit. It gave space for healing and the speaking in tongues and prophecy. And I loved it and witnessed God do amazing things there. However, after about 2 years, I became aware that the church was struggling in a number of different areas. The senior pastor was part of a movement called G12, which had originated in Bogota in Colombia. And essentially the idea of G12 is that discipleship and leadership and mentoring takes place with one person who has 12 disciples or leaders under them. So the key leader in Bogota, Colombia, he had 12 disciples, 12 leaders under him who each served right across the world, and they had 12, and they had 12, etc., etc., etc. Practically, for us here in Durham, that meant that our senior pastor, he was accountable and he was mentored by a church leader in another part of the country, obviously separate from our church there in Durham. This leadership structure caused a growing and significant disagreement in the church for some of the members who felt that there was no accountability with the senior leader and the rest of the congregation. So unfortunately, as it turned out, while the senior pastor and his wife were on holiday, some of the members called a meeting to outline their issues with his leadership. They decided to write him a letter detailing their concerns. And so inevitably, when the pastor returned from holiday, he found this letter on his doormat. He felt he couldn't stay leader any longer, and so he decided to resign. This led to the church splitting, a large group following the senior pastor, some remaining with the new church that was being formed in Durham, and sadly some leaving the church altogether. So why do I tell you this story? Well, I believe that nearly all of us who've been Christians or churchgoers for any significant amount of time can share a similar story. Stories of church splits, of leadership failures, of controversy, rejection, and the pain that follows. And it is something that I've touched on a number of times over the last year, partly because I'm aware that many at St. Gabriel's have been hurt by church structures and leadership. Before the summer, we did a series trying to look at this in a bit more detail, and particularly how we might restore our joy in God and his salvation and restore our joy in his church. And so I might sound like a broken record on this issue, but I hope it communicates how much I care about it. And more importantly, I hope it shows my prayer and hope that St. Gabriel's can be a church that is safe, a church that fosters healing and restoration and redemption. And it seems to be an issue that God keeps reminding me of. And preparing for this talk and our reading for today is a case in point. As I've said, we're doing just a mini-series on this book in James, dipping into a number of key passages. Last week we looked at chapter 1, where James tells us that the way that we live, our actions, our words, it creates a positive or a negative environment for the seed of faith to grow in our lives. You may have that seed of faith. It's been planted there. But James says that the way that you live determines how that seed is going to grow and be nurtured. And then in our passage we heard this morning from James 2, we kind of find the summary of his whole letter. He says, "What good is it, dear brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith, but don't show it by your actions? Can that kind of faith save anyone?" Essentially, James is telling us that following Jesus is not only about agreeing with theological information, it's about living according to the ways of Jesus. And the way that we live matters because it reflects our faith. And so at the beginning of our chapter this morning, James uses the example of church gatherings to show how the church's values and culture are reflected in how we treat people. And he specifically points out the problem of favouritism, showing favour to the rich while neglecting the needy. We might think that we've moved beyond this kind of overt favouritism in the church, but maybe the truth is that we've simply become better at hiding it. While we might not outwardly favour the wealthy today, we often show favouritism for lots of other reasons. We still marginalise people based on our biases, whether they're related to age or gender or background or some other factor. And James wants to expose this duplicity. If we claim to be followers of Christ, yet show favoritism or discriminate, our actions, he says, reveal our evil motives. And he doesn't mince with his words. Verse 4 says this. He says, Doesn't this discrimination show that your judgments are guided by evil motives? And then verse 8 and 9, yes, indeed, it is good when you obey the royal law as found in the scriptures, love your neighbor as yourself. But if you favor some people over others, you are committing a sin. You are guilty of breaking the law. The sad reality is that favoritism still exists, not only in the church, but in every human heart. A couple of years ago, I was really grateful to attend an unconscious bias training organised by the Diocese of Sheffield. An unconscious bias is when our brains automatically categorise people or assign values to those categories. And that can be based on our upbringing, our experiences, the media that we might consume. And I found this training, it was really helpful in beginning my journey of reflection and repentance as I realized my own biases in my heart. It also caused me to ask some critical questions about the life of church. Does our membership reflect the diversity of our community? Are we welcoming people from all age groups, ethnicities, social, economic backgrounds, and genders? Where are the gaps and who might feel excluded? Ultimately, as the writer James says, do we favor some people over others? Of course, if we look at the life of Jesus, we see how he consistently resisted favoritism. Jesus showed love to the marginalized, to those society had deemed less worthy. Let's take the story of Zacchaeus as just one example, the tax collector in Luke 19, a man hated by his own people for working with the Romans. Jesus didn't just ignore Zacchaeus' flaws. He invited himself into Zacchaeus' home, bringing salvation to his household. It's just one example of Jesus continually breaking down the societal norms and demonstrating his love for all, especially those who are often overlooked. I was reflecting recently with a friend who's also a church leader, and we were lamenting about the number of church leadership failures that have been exposed in recent years. And I remember asking them how I as a leader can guard against this happening in my own life and in our church. And immediately my friend recommended a book called A Church Called Tove by Scott McKnight and Laura Barringer. And over the summer, I listened to it and for a number of reasons found it deeply helpful. Now, tov is the Hebrew word for good, and it's used hundreds of times in the Hebrew scriptures. And so the authors use this concept to propose ways to build a tov, or a good church. Now, a lot of the book, it is quite American, and it does focus on American megachurches, but there are some really helpful insights that I drew from it. In the book, they said this: our book is about wounded healers and wounded resistors, women and men who did the right thing, who told the truth, who suffered rejection, intimidation, and re-victimization, but who persevered in telling the truth so the truth would be known. In part one of the book, they explore how a church's culture can become toxic. Churches ultimately are shaped by the culture they inhabit, which then reinforces beliefs and behaviors. They go on to contrast a compassionate church, which are safe and secure and open, and they contrast that with a toxic church or dysfunctional churches demonstrated through narcissism, power through fear, and the way that leadership responds to criticism. They say this: in a healthy tov culture, in a good culture, leaders will avoid denial and spin in favor of finding and telling the truth, even when the truth is painful. In part two of the book, Scott and Laura propose the key characteristics of what a tov church, what a good church looks like. They explain this as the gospel, essentially, the message of goodness. It's about God's goodness coming to us in Jesus, who is good and is thus making us agents of goodness. And so if we have the slide up, Martha, I've realized you might not be able to see this very well, having put it up there, but they essentially outline the circle of tov, nurturing habits of goodness. And so they suggest this: nurture empathy. Secondly, nurture grace. Thirdly, put people first. Fourthly, tell the truth. Fifth, nurture justice. Number 6, nurture service. And finally, nurture Christ's likeness. And I find that really, really helpful. Number 1, empathy and compassion. 2, grace and graciousness. Number 3, putting people first. Number 4, truth telling. 5, justice. 6, service. And finally, Christ's likeness. The circle of tov. In summary, such churches will resist abuses of power, promote healing, and eradicate the toxic fallout that infects so many of our Christian organizations. Now, this is not the time or the place to go into any in-depth review or for me to share maybe some of my critiques of the book as well. But I did want to draw our attention to it this morning in light of our passage in James, because of the journey I believe we're on as a church. In verse 17, James writes, "So you see, faith by itself isn't enough unless it produces good deeds. it is dead and useless. So with that in mind, I'd like to reframe this verse, if I may, in the context of our church. So you see, calling yourself a Christian church isn't enough. Unless the church creates a culture of goodness, healing, resisting abuses of power, and caring for those on the margins, unless it does these things, it is dead and useless. So what would it look like if St. Gabriel's truly became a Tove church, a church where it had this goodness at the heart of it? Imagine a community where every person, regardless of their background or status, feels valued and known. A place where healing happens because we're willing to face hard truths, acknowledge past hurts, and seek restoration. A church where we're not just concerned about growing in numbers, but about growing in goodness, cultivating an atmosphere of Christ-likeness. A church where barriers between generations are broken down, where people from different cultures worship together in harmony, and where those on the fringes of society are brought into the very heart of the community. This is the vision of a Tove church, a good, healing, and restorative place where the love of Christ is not just talked about, but lived out. And even as I say those words and outline that vision, I hear how deeply challenging it is for me and for the leadership here at St. Gabriel's. It is not an easy task, and we have and should do so much more and can do so much more. And it reflects what James is trying to say here in his book. He's challenging us to reflect on the ways that we might unconsciously or consciously show favoritism, even within the church. It is, of course, easy to say that we love everyone equally, but our actions may reveal otherwise. And this is why James insists that faith by itself isn't enough. It needs to be backed by actions that reflect Christ's love and justice. So let's bring this a bit closer to home and maybe reflect on our own lives firstly. In our daily lives and in the way that we outwork our Christian faith, who do we favour? Are there people we unintentionally overlook? Perhaps it's a newcomer sitting quietly at the back, or those from a different social, economic background, or people simply that we don't have much in common with. Maybe these are the ones that God is calling us to love actively, to extend that hand of welcome, and to invite into the heart of our community. And maybe for yourself, just think about how you interact with others at church. Who do you naturally are drawn to, and maybe who do you tend to avoid? How will you, in the life of this church and community, reflect on the goodness of God? How will we aim to resist favoritism, pursue justice, and embody the love of Christ, so that we can truly cultivate a church that is Tove, a good, healing and restorative place for all? So just in a few moments, I want to offer us two ways that we might respond. I'm so conscious that when we come to a Sunday and we might hear a talk, that we often just leave, maybe taking something away, but not actually considering what we're going to do differently. So I'm going to offer you two ways, just in a few moments, to respond to this. So firstly, you might want to, just in a few moments that we're going to leave, to respond just quietly in your own heart, allowing Christ's Spirit to speak to you and to see where you might have some unconscious bias, where you might show favoritism. And you might just want to sit with that in quiet on your own. But also, you might be a bit more of an external processor and you want to talk to the person next to you. And so that might be an opportunity now, and you might want to reflect together on St. Gabriel's and on the back of what I've just been outlining. How are we as a church in this area, in the way that James is challenging us in this passage. So we're going to just spend 2 or 3 minutes, and there's a response. If you're an introvert, you can stay quiet and reflect in your own heart. But if you're a bit extroverted, maybe turn to the person next to you. And then I'm just going to draw us together in about 2 or 3 minutes by praying for us, and then we'll sing together. So 2 ways to respond. Let's spend 2 or 3 minutes doing it together.